Tony didn't groom Christopher to lead. He groomed him to absorb the blast. From the very beginning, Christopher Moltisanti is framed as the future. Family blood, protected, promoted, forgiven. But look closer, and the pattern isn't mentorship. It's insulation. Every mistake is tolerated not because Christopher is improving, but because he's useful. He draws attention. He takes risks. He absorbs chaos that should land somewhere higher up. The Italy trip exposes this perfectly. A supposed education, a chance to build real alliances, to learn how power actually works. And Christopher never even makes it out of the hotel room. And yet, nothing changes. No consequences. No reevaluation. Just more responsibility layered onto the same liability. That's not grooming a successor. That's positioning a buffer. Because when the pressure comes, legal, emotional, operational, Tony doesn't need a leader. He needs someone close enough to trust, broken enough to control, and expendable enough to lose. And once you see Christopher that way, his entire arc stops being tragic coincidence and starts looking like design. By the end, the question isn't why Christopher failed. It's whether he was ever meant to survive. The most devastating moment in the Italy trip is not the diplomacy, not the cultural mismatch, and certainly not the spectacle of American gangsters cosplaying as men of lineage and consequence. It is a single, silent image. Christopher Moltisanti in a car, briefly stripped of his bravado, looking like a man who can finally see the outline of his own ruin. The tragedy is almost offensively simple. He goes to Italy, an alleged homecoming, a supposed education, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to connect to ancestry, observe the old world machine up close, and expand the family's reach. And he spends it anesthetized in a hotel room. No crater, no volcano, no beach, no introductions, no conversation that might evolve into an alliance. Not even the smallest act of curiosity that could be mistaken for growth. The itinerary he follows is the same one addiction always offers. A locked door, a dulled mind, and the comforting lie that time will wait. The show lingers on his face because it understands something that the mythology of the life will never admit. The greatest cost is not merely legal exposure or violence. It is the theft of one's own existence. Addiction does not only kill bodies, it cancels futures. Christopher's eternal grievance, his hunger for respect, significance, and status, collides with the truth that he cannot even earn a passport stamp without turning it into a relapse. He talks like a man no one can stop. He lives like a man stopped by everything. And that is the point. The sadness sharpens on rewatch because the audience already knows what Christopher does not. There will be no second chance, no later trip, no redemption arc with better lighting. That car ride becomes a funeral for a life that is still breathing. It also becomes a quiet mirror for every character who carries a private inventory of things they wanted to do someday, as if mortality is a negotiable deadline. The series has always been obsessed with missed chances. Junior's own regret about never going, Carmela's aching sense of deprivation until she finally gets her Paris, Meadows' flirtation with going abroad, and the ways relationships reroute young ambition. The Italy trip is merely the show's most efficient demonstration of the theme. The world is wide, time is narrow, and these people keep choosing a smaller room. Of course, the Italy trip is not only an indictment of Christopher, it is also a management audit of Tony Soprano, a boss whose long-term planning routinely resembles improvisation with a migraine. The same man who cannot sustain a healthy home life, a stable crew, or a consistent moral framework, is also the man who allegedly has a multi-year succession plan, grooming Christopher to be the future. The premise is so audacious it almost deserves applause. Tony looks at a volatile, impulsive addict with a talent for self-sabotage and decides, with the confidence of a man who confuses blood ties with competence, that this is his heir. What exactly is being evaluated in that decision? Leadership? Temperament? Judgment? The ability to stay conscious through a business meeting? The evidence points the other way for years, including in the very episode designed to showcase Italy as an education. Christopher cannot even participate. Yet Tony keeps the fantasy alive into the later seasons, even promoting him, even pretending the plan remains rational. The more charitable reading is that Tony sees something salvageable. Christopher understands the politics of the life better than he is credited for, has courage, can execute violence without hesitation, and is occasionally willing to confront New York. With enough grooming, perhaps he could become a solid underboss, maybe even a functional acting boss. The less charitable reading, and the one the show repeatedly earns, is that Tony's plan is not succession at all. It is insulation. Tony does not build the next generation because he believes in continuity. He builds it because he fears exposure. A younger mouthpiece reduces the boss's visibility and concentrates legal risk somewhere else. Christopher, as family, is the one person Tony hopes will take heat and keep quiet when it counts. Loyalty is not cultivated as a virtue. It is cultivated as a liability shield. Call it nepotism if one wants to be polite. Call it a fall guy pipeline if one wants to be accurate. This is where the series' larger thesis presses down. Tony and the institution around him are not building an empire. They are walking toward an abyss. The organization is a dying breed in the modern era. Law enforcement improves, margins shrink, corporate systems reduce the old neighborhood shakedown economy, and the new recruits are more often liabilities than assets. Tony openly says early on that he arrived at the end of something. The fixation on blood and legacy reads less like tradition and more like panic. The boss knows the likely endings: prison, assassination, or a slow crawl into irrelevance. He also knows, in moments he suppresses as quickly as they arrive, that he is emotionally toxic and spiritually hollow, which clashes with his desire to be viewed as a respectable patriarch, especially by his daughter. So he clings to a story in which there is a future, in which a successor exists, in which the consequences can be deferred. Christopher becomes that story because there are not many credible alternatives. The tragicomic truth is that Tony cannot develop the next generation because he does not know how to develop anything that is not a defense mechanism. And Christopher, a hollowed-out emblem of what this thing has become, is the perfect symbol. The legacy is not being passed down. It is being diminished. The Italy trip itself reinforces the absurdity of Tony's choices. He brings Christopher, who spends the trip intoxicated, and Polly, whose cultural ignorance is so comprehensive it becomes a case study. Viewers can reasonably ask why the entourage was not stronger. Why not bring proven earners with imagination and ambition who might forge new relationships and identify new business lines? One answer is obvious: because those people might also forge new relationships that do not route through Tony. A boss who worries about external scheming does not empower ambitious subordinates to establish independent ties with powerful partners abroad. Keeping negotiations personal and tightly controlled may mean eating a little less overall, but it also reduces the risk that someone returns home with contacts, leverage, and ideas that threaten the center. Another answer is logistical. The bench is not deep. A second in command needs to remain home to manage operations. Certain volatile personalities are untrustworthy abroad. Others are compromised by suspicion, legal exposure, or internal resentments. Still others simply have not proven themselves yet. Under that lens, Polly is loyal on paper, has seniority, and has always wanted to go. Christopher is family and therefore an investment, or at least a test. The problem is that on paper is not where prosecutions happen, and loyalty is not where competence comes from. The trip becomes an inadvertent confession that Tony's organization is not stocked with talent, it is stocked with coping mechanisms. Then comes the outside perspective, which functions like a spotlight on what the show gets right and what it chooses to stylize. The depiction of Livia Soprano lands with surgical accuracy. The guilt-drenched emotional manipulation, the weaponized fragility, the sanctimonious cruelty performed as martyrdom. The Catholic theater also hits its mark. Outward reverence paired with private indulgence, and the miracle by which the deceased are instantly promoted to saintly status, no matter how they behaved in life. The domestic economy of favors, contractors, and help that never appears to require payment is rendered with the right kind of knowing implication. Yet the show also selects what it will not fully embrace. Ethnic prejudice is portrayed broadly, but the specific relationship to Jews is painted more cynically than some lived experiences would suggest, where Jews are treated less as targets and more as valued allies, accountants, doctors, lawyers, and social partners who can solve problems and produce celebrations. The depiction of spousal violence is another choice. Christopher's abusive behavior toward Adriana is shown with brutal clarity, yet Tony, who has every trait that would make such violence plausible, never strikes Carmela, even when provoked. Some find that restraint dramatically convenient, preserving the protagonist's watchability. Others argue it is a missed realism. Food culture is similarly stylized. The series is saturated with Italian dishes and Italian restaurants, as it should be, but it can occasionally feel like these characters live in a culinary bubble, despite being the sort of men who would happily consume other cuisines the moment it suited them. And language use is comparatively restrained. In many families, Italian becomes the private channel for anger and conflict, deliberately excluding children. On screen, spoken Italian appears, but less as a constant domestic tool, and more as an occasional cultural accent. These critiques do not diminish the series, they clarify it. Accuracy is not a single target. It is a set of choices, some precise, some strategic, all in service of the narrative's moral and thematic structure. If the Italy trip is a symbolic failure, it also becomes an obvious inflection point in the ongoing debate about whether Christopher should have been removed much earlier. The argument is simple. The trip offered a clear opportunity to learn, observe real leadership, network with serious people, and demonstrate basic responsibility. Christopher does none of it. He wastes the gift and, even in the small domestic details, fails to behave like an adult with obligations. In a rational organization, this is when a boss stops pretending. Yet the series makes the counterpoint equally clear. Christopher survives and rises because he is family. Multiple characters state, directly and indirectly, that without blood ties, he would have been killed early. Perhaps the moment his reckless behavior endangered the group, perhaps as soon as it became apparent he would never stabilize. Nepotism is not a side note. It is the plot's operating system. Christopher's repeated escapes from consequences only make his later collapses more predictable. Each time he is spared, he learns the wrong lesson, that immunity is permanent. He never adjusts his behavior because the environment teaches him that failure is survivable, until it is not. The moral rot of this system is clearest in the Adriana catastrophe and everything that follows. Christopher ultimately gives up the woman he claims to love, not out of devotion to the organization, but out of devotion to himself. He sees, in a fleeting vision of ordinary life, what it would mean to live as a nobody, and recoils. He chooses status, money, and the familiar comfort of power over humanity. That choice is not heroism. It is cowardice dressed in tradition. From Tony's perspective, it is also confirmation that Christopher cannot be trusted to perceive threats until they are already inside the home. If Christopher were sober, perhaps he would have noticed sooner that his own partner had become an existential risk. Instead, the addiction dulls his awareness and leaves the boss exposed. Here, the show refuses to pretend that brutality is ever principled. Tony's violence toward Christopher after Adriana's fate is not justice, it is dominance. It is also hypocrisy. The boss demands loyalty, receives it in the ugliest possible form, and still treats the loyal subordinate as disposable. The idea that codes protect anyone is revealed as theater. Even the concept of maid status becomes negotiable when power is personal and the boss is related to the victim. Christopher endures humiliation because he knows he is on borrowed time and because he recognizes the uncomfortable truth that, in this hierarchy, being right is irrelevant when being spared is the only currency. Operationally, the decision not to eliminate Christopher for addiction and repeated disobedience also corrodes Tony's credibility. The organization's own rules are clear enough. A subordinate who cannot control drugs is an exposure risk and a liability. An intervention that stops short of execution is treated as exceptional leniency, and everyone knows it. Every relapse becomes another referendum on Tony's judgment. Add in other offenses: reckless criminal activity after direct orders to stop, reckless associations, and constant volatility, and Christopher becomes the kind of person any competent boss would remove for the health of the whole. Tony keeps him anyway, not because it is rational, but because Tony's decisions are rarely rational when they intersect with family, guilt, and the fantasies he uses to manage his fear. Even Christopher's refusal to cooperate with authorities is not pure loyalty. It is self-preservation. He cannot imagine functioning in the civilian world. He does not want to be the guy with the bad haircut and witness protection. He wants the identity the life gives him, even if that identity is slowly killing him. By the time Christopher dies, the question is no longer whether it will happen, but what story Tony will tell himself about why it happened. The crash provides the perfect stage for Tony's signature move: moral rationalization after the fact. Several motives compete, and the show allows the audience to hold them simultaneously, because human selfishness rarely arrives in a single, clean flavor. There is resentment over creative humiliation, the way the film project exposes private dynamics, mocks Tony in coded form, and reopens wounds that never healed. There is jealousy and possessiveness around Juliana, because Tony's ego reacts poorly to anything he considers his being taken, even when he claims to be done with it. There is practical calculation. Christopher, still using, still unstable, still driving impaired, is an ongoing risk to business and to Tony personally. There is also Tony's broader descent into degeneracy, a late series embrace of his darkest impulses with fewer and fewer excuses. In that moment, the child's car seat becomes a prop of conscience, an object Tony can point to as justification, whether or not it is the real driver. If Christopher is a junkie who could have killed a child, then eliminating him becomes a civic duty rather than a personal convenience. Tony repeats the detail afterward, as if repetition can transform self-interest into righteousness. The show even underlines the psychology through the lens of therapy and sociopathy, the way sympathy for children and vulnerability can be deployed as emotional camouflage. The seat is not proof of Tony's morality. It is proof of his need to feel moral while doing what he wants. And if Christopher might have died from the injuries anyway, that ambiguity only makes Tony's action easier to digest, because nothing soothes guilt like the suggestion that the outcome was inevitable. In the end, Christopher's Italy trip functions as a thesis statement for his entire arc. A man desperate for meaning, given opportunities he cannot hold, sabotaged by addiction, protected by nepotism, and ultimately destroyed by the same boss who claimed to be building him into something greater. The volcano he never saw is more than a missed tourist stop. It is a symbol of everything this world promises: heritage, purpose, belonging, and everything it denies through its own internal machinery. The tragedy is not that Christopher fails to become a leader. The tragedy is that everyone around him pretends he could, when the real plan was always simpler: use him until he cannot be used, then explain the disposal as necessity. That is the genius of this narrative and its most merciless joke. The characters insist they are men of honor. The story shows, patiently and repeatedly, that honor is merely the language they use to narrate their appetites. Immunity is not stability. Subscribe.